Okay, we're officially recording. So welcome to the Vermont Climate Council Science and Data Subcommittee. I'm TJ Poore, co-chair with Leslie Ann Dupini-Giroux. Welcome. I am going to pull up the agenda for today and share that on the screen briefly. Hopefully folks can see this. This is linked at on the Climate Council website. Go over the agenda review is topic number one, just a brief check-in on subcommittee membership. Leslie Ann and I met with the cross-sector subcommittee, and we would like to report out to the rest of the subcommittee on that. Then we will get into a discussion on the subcommittee scope. All subcommittee members should have received an email last night, and then another one this morning with some revisions, further revisions to the draft scope that we could discuss today. Then we need to get into discussion of the work plan and next meeting agenda, public comment, and before we adjourn. I want to note three specific things that have been raised over the last week to myself and Leslie Ann. I think as part of the work plan discussion, we want to talk about two things. One is the RFI responses. So more broadly, the Climate Council issued an RFI for technical assistance, and how this committee can work to review those and set up the request for proposals going forward. Also, I'd like to acknowledge that we've received several documents on from subcommittee members and from the public, and I want to acknowledge those that we've received those. Thank you, and discuss how we incorporate review of those documents into the work plan. Finally, I think I'd like to add a Jane sent around the governance training materials. I think it came up last meeting that folks need some training on open meeting laws, etc., particularly new subcommittee members. So I want to leave space in the agenda to just get an overview from Jane about that. And I think that could happen perhaps in between the work plan discussion and the next meeting agenda discussion. Do folks have any comments on the agenda? And I should say, thank you all for showing up. It's a beautiful day outside. I just dove right into the business. So it's good to see you all. And with that, any comments on the agenda?
TJ, I'm not sure if I'm misremembering this, but was there some thought or discussion to pushing back the 1 o'clock start time a little bit, or did I misremember that?
We can discuss that. Why don't we put that in the next meeting agenda topic? Thank you. I think you had brought that up. And we should make sure that all subcommittee members can make it to the meetings and fully participate. So. Thank you. Okay, so hearing no objections or additions to the agenda, I just wanted to go right into subcommittee membership discussion. As far as I know, we still haven't heard back from Linda McGinnis. She is still dealing with a family emergency, and I'm going to propose that she's filling the role that we had identified as an economist that we'd like on the subcommittee. in that perspective and expertise. And I don't see that need as being immediate to the extent that we need to take any action today without knowing, 3 business days since Friday, any more detail on her availability to participate. So I'd just like to postpone just further discussion of that until next week, unless anybody has any objections.
No, I agree with that.
I think okay, great. The other thing to discuss on subcommittee membership, we had a discussion last time on the role that Linda Gray was invited to play in terms of her perspective with different communities in Vermont, and we discussed Leslie Ann and I as co-chairs meeting with the Just Transitions subcommittee and Jane to forge a path ahead there and see if there is, because they had a lot of potential members, to see if there was a way we could interact or have maybe one of their members participate here. I think that is still to come. I just kind of wanted to give a update there that we haven't lost that thread. But unless Leslie Ann, you've moved the ball down the road there that I don't know about.
So that's Lisa Ryan that we're talking about, right? And
right,
her,
I may have misstated her name. Yeah.
No. So that's okay. So the only other update is I have also reached out to Sue Minter in her capacity as one of the co-chairs of the Just Transitions Committee, and we have to try and get our calendars together to have a sort of initial conversation. But
great. Thank you. So we'll maybe leave that topic for the next agenda as well, and a report back update on that. Okay, moving through the agenda quickly here. Number 3 is a report on the co-chairs meeting between the science and data and cross-sector subcommittees, and I'm going to ask Leslie Ann to lead this one.
okay, thanks, TJ. So TJ and I, Peter Walk, Richard Cowart, Jane met yesterday to chit chat a little bit about how we could start thinking about the ways in which our 2 subcommittees would work together, primarily because both of us have this sort of science and data piece and the interaction across there. Oh, Jared was also on the call. Sorry, Jared, I missed mentioning that you were also present. And Jared is the actual liaison between our 2 subcommittees. And so if there's any piece that I'm missing as we sort of go through, I'm going to invite both Jared and TJ to sort of jump in and make any corrections and additions. So there are a couple things that sort of came out of that. And part of it has to do with the exact way that we're going to be working together, whether it's sort of in tandem or if it's a sort of stepped piece. And because we're the sort of holders for a lot of the data and analyses perspectives that we would then use to advise the full council. And so making sure that we work very, very closely is one piece in there. Some of the other pieces that came out were trying to get an agreement on what the final climate action plan would look like, so that we could, and this came up in our committee last week, sort of back out from there so that we could figure out what is feasible and what is possible in the time frame that we have. And part of that has to do with identifying the holes and the gaps that are currently in place, so that we know about, so that we can convey those to the cross-sector subcommittees, so that they are aware of when they're trying to come up with various policies, which levers that they pull, and what are some of the outcomes that would result from pulling some of those levers. There was a lot of time that we spent chit-chatting about the actual timing, and the timing in the context of responding to the law itself. And so there are a couple moving pieces in there. So one of the big moving pieces is a comprehensive energy plan and the timing of that. And TJ, I'm going to let you speak to that once I've sort of set this up. There's also the piece of the hiring of the contractors to assist us with our work and how that's going to shake out, and the ways in which the information and the analyses that they give out, when is that going to be available, and how are we going to be able to use that in order to make our recommendations to the council so that the council can actually draft the plan itself. And so there was the feeling that we probably are not going to have the contractors on board to actually do the analyses by the time that we currently are supposed to be giving the recommendations to the council. And so there was a lot of discussion on what that might mean for us. And so the other piece that we need to think about from the law perspective is that the final plan that we come up with as a council has to match the prescriptions that are in the law. Otherwise, the plan would be considered not to exist for the purposes of the law. And so that is one of the pieces that is critical in terms of this moving backwards in understanding the plan that we develop, how it addresses and speaks to all of the requirements that are in the law itself. And so one of the recommendations that came out of our conversation was that we need to have a full and honest conversation with the council itself in terms of what is possible in the timeline that we're given, what could be possible if we had an extended timeline, and then the actual process of revisiting that timeline vis-a-vis the actual outcomes that we're going to be coming up with. And so thinking about it in terms of a proactive request to the legislature versus a reactive or retrospective request to the legislature in terms of adjusting the timeline or adjusting the output that comes out of the council's recommendations. Then there was another piece in terms of trying to sort out and keep clear the moving on parallel tracks between the comprehensive energy plan and TJ's responsibility around that vis-a-vis the Vermont Climate Council and what we are looking at and the pieces that sort of cross-talk with the comprehensive energy plan, and which one feeds the other and which parts are independent. And again, when I transfer it back over to TJ, he'll be able to speak a little bit more to that. And then the last big piece is around the timeline itself. And this is where the RFIs come in, the requests for information that TJ mentioned, and Jane will probably also have some feedback on. There were 15 of those that were received, and 13 out of those 15 talked about the timeline not being a realistic timeline. And so what we are planning to do, and I'm sort of teeing this up for Jane, is to use our subcommittee, Science and Data Subcommittee, to assist with parsing through those responses and using them to help with the creation of the RFP that will go out. And that would then sort of determine whether it's a single RFP or a multiple RFP. And as TJ mentioned a few minutes ago, we still have an econometric analysis gap in the work that we're doing, which I think is a little bit different from the economist piece that we were talking about. So we've got two of these that we're sort of working together. And the final thing is for us to actually come up with a working process whereby we can do a lot of crosstalk and crosswalk between our committees, particularly the cross-sector committee. So with that, please let me know if I missed anything. I went back through, I've got 6 pages of notes here, and I went back through and just sort of tried to make sure I got all of the highlights of the things that we talked about. So Jared, I see your hand up.
Thanks, Leslie. And I just have one quick clarifying question because I had to leave the meeting before it ended. So the last part that you just said in terms of the gap around econometric analysis, I believe that I heard that in the context of it's not part of the plan for the comprehensive energy plan analysis that TJ kind of walked through and is planning on that side of things. It was not clear to me my recollection was that there was a proposal for economic impact analysis to be assessed as part of the RFI for the council. And so I just wanted to make sure, maybe Jane, I mean, we'll know more once we see what those RFIs are, but I want to make sure that I'm understanding that right. And there's a distinction between the types of analysis that are planned for the CEP versus what we're requesting. I'm sorry, I should use all the acronyms, the CEP, the Comprehensive Energy Plan, versus the type of analysis that we've requested in our RFI for the council.
That's exactly right, Jared. And I think that would be a great segue to TJ to maybe provide a couple more sentences of clarification around that, because it's non-trivial.
Right, thanks. And I'll, I can go into a little more detail at a future meeting, I think, when we have a little more time, but just for the full subcommittee and those watching, the Department of Public Service also has a requirement to complete a comprehensive energy plan, which is an overlapping but distinct requirement by statute that the legislature did not modify. So we have two plans that overlap, aren't the same. They don't obviate the need for each other, but they also need to coordinate. The comprehensive energy plan statute was modified a bit to require consistency with the Climate Action Plan and the Global Warming Solutions Act requirements. The Climate Action Plan has to be informed by the Comprehensive Energy Plan. So there's a symbiotic relationship there that we are trying to work through to be efficient and provide the most value to Vermont in getting us from here to there. As part of that, we I see your hand up, Richard, and I'll just talk about the modeling real quick, if that is okay. As part of that, I will. We've engaged in partnership with the Agency of Natural Resources, a group called Stockholm Energy Institute through NESCOM, which is an organization of air regulators across the country. And they are using the Low Emissions Analysis Platform, I believe is the acronym LEAP. We're using that to model scenarios, greenhouse gas and renewable energy scenarios going forward. Now that's an energy plan timeline. It's on an energy plan timeline right now, but also modeling greenhouse gas scenarios and pathways consistent with the Climate Action Plan. And so that model will have cost information. One clarification is that Stockholm Energy Institute and that model is not doing any econometric analysis like that REMI type modeling that you often see in policy proposals of here's the impact to GDP, here's the impact to jobs. Stockholm Energy Institute does not do that, but the outputs from their model can be put into that type of model, and the energy plan writ large is planning on doing that. And so ideally, we will do that in a cohesive and efficient manner with the Climate Action Plan. But I do want to be clear that the energy plan is the department's and state government's own obligation by statute. It's kind of in its own, well, it's its own requirement, and we want it to be interactive. We want it to interact with the Climate Council. We want it to kind of be iterative and inform and be informed by the work we're all doing here. But it is not it's not the Climate Council's work either. So I just that's my caveat that I have to end explaining it by I'm contractually obligated to do that. So so that's my high level summary, and I can go into more details about what's going to happen at another time. But Richard, you had a question there.
Yeah, just for clarity here, is it as simple as that the Climate Action Plan needs to address greenhouse gas releases that are not related to energy, and the Comprehensive Energy Plan does not address those? Or is there more to it than that?
There's more to it. To that. That's certainly part of it. But the way I think about it is the climate action plan, and this is a gross oversimplification, but Jane didn't correct me when I said this earlier. So it's greenhouse gas mitigation around all sectors and climate adaptation. The energy plan is least cost energy system planning with goals of affordability, environmental sustainability and greenhouse gas reduction, reliability, sustainability. It's also the electric plan as well. And it takes a broader kind of energy system perspective. So it's narrower in some ways, but broader in other ways. And so it's like a Venn diagram. I think I need to create a Venn diagram that just shows what's covered by both and what's not. I'll take that as a takeaway. But
I love that challenge. That idea of a challenge, TJ.
Yeah. Well, I will. Yeah. Let's work on that together, Jane.
That's a very helpful response, TJ. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and as an output, it mightn't hurt to have it in one of our documents so that you don't keep saying the same thing over and over and explaining the difference. You know, if you get that word picture just right, then it just makes everything sort of fit into place. So,
Yeah. So I think to summarize, I think there's a lot more to come out of that subcommittee chair discussion that we're going to need to set up more to really define the interaction there. And I do, you know, I mentioned having the RFI component in the work plan discussion, but because it came up here, I wonder if now is a better time to talk about that.
I'm happy to do it now or whenever you'd like.
Yeah. Why don't we go ahead and talk about it now? Because I think
that makes sense, Jane, because then it gets that whole flow going.
Sure. So afternoon, everybody. The RFI went out actually before I was hired. Billy Coster led that on behalf of A&R and with consultation with TJ, A&R, Climate Council. And so it was out in February. We got as Leslie Ann referred to, we got 15 responses back on that. If it would be helpful, as I tee up what our ask is to the Science and Data Committee around those proposals, I will share the RFI, but if I can, I opened it. Let me see. I'm hoping this is the right thing. Is this showing a PDF with questionnaire at the top? I have too much open on my computer.
Yes.
Okay, great. And is it big enough that you can actually see it?
Yes.
Okay. I just wanted to suggest or a little bit of context. The RFI was put out with 8 questions to respond to. And I think perhaps as we talk through them really briefly, and you can all look at this later yourselves, but I will share this. But there were 8 questions, and so it might be helpful just to sort of go through and what the 8 questions were that we put out there. And then obviously the RFI informed us, the proposals informed us around whether or not these were in fact the right 8 questions to answer and be asking, but also just to highlight where I'm starting to understand the overlap with the modeling and contractual work already happening through the Public Service Department and DEC, Department of Environmental Conservation in A&R, to advance the work of the CEP, the Comprehensive Energy Plan. And what isn't being done, perhaps, already. So first and foremost, the first thing was around establishing a Vermont-specific carbon budget and to actually include natural and working lands, wetlands, land use change. And along the lines, while doing that, to recommend any changes if needed to Vermont's, the way we currently do our emissions inventory methodology in order to obviously be consistent with the carbon budget. So Am I right? And I'm sort of, this is a good ground truth for me, and hopefully we can think of this a little bit as a working meeting, but am I correct that that is not being done right now through the Comprehensive Energy Plan?
So recommending and so the modeling, because we started it, it's comprehensive energy plan modeling, but A&R was, even before the Climate Council started, A&R, Agency of Natural Resources, and the Department of Environmental Conservation, even before the Climate Council was established, was planning on doing greenhouse gas mitigation work anyway in connection with its climate inventory. So the modeling will include some of those working lands type analysis, greenhouse gas analysis.
Mm-hmm. Okay, but maybe not quite comprehensive enough yet. Is that?
You know, we in our maybe this is just because it's the department's perspective and where I come from, but we haven't gotten into the details of that portion of the model yet. So,
Okay.
I'm having trouble answering how far we're
No
able
problem.
to go there.
Okay. Well,
yeah,
let me
just second what
Good.
TJ said is I'm not sure we've gotten to that level of granularity yet, which is why it was included here.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. I'll just keep rolling through them then. So the second one was as identified here, review and comprehensively identify implementation and policy mechanisms for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And so this, I think, is the sort of meat of like where we pull what levers and what are the outcomes with respect to what we want to accomplish with our greenhouse gas emission reductions. 3, this is model existing and proposed emission control scenarios, all these, the subset, but this is the meat in my mind, I think, TJ, of the work that's currently being handled through NESCOM and the SI contract with DEC and Public Service Department.
Yeah, I think that's mostly the case. I think, you know, the first 3 of those for sure, or at least the first 2 of those for sure. The secondary economic benefits and costs, I think of that as the REMI econometric type modeling. That is not the Stockholm Energy Institute LEAP modeling, but it's kind of the next step after that we're planning on doing but aren't contracted yet. And then things like public health impacts are, again, secondary. All of these, of the energy choices we make, all of that goes into the energy plan, but not specific to the modeling. So,
great.
Can I stop you for a second, Jane? It looked like Jared had a question, and if it was on one of the first 2 items, I didn't want you to get too far along.
Go ahead. I can't see that, so thank you while I'm sharing.
Thanks, TJ. Thanks, Jane. I just want to make sure, and this may be worth a more in-depth and detailed conversation later, but I want to make sure that we have kind of common understanding of the term carbon budget in number 1. As I understand that definition, it's emissions permitted over a certain period of time. And at the one way of interpreting carbon budget would be that it's set for us in the legislation based on the GWSA targets, say it's 26% below 2005 levels by 2025. Another way that I've seen the term carbon budget used is a cumulative amount of emissions over a time frame, say between 2020 and 2025. As I understand and read the Global Warming Solutions Act, it's primarily concerned with what our reported emissions are in the year 2025, i.e. being below that, I can't remember exactly what it is off the top of my head, 7-point-something million metric tons, versus what the cumulative amount of emissions would be between 2020 and 2025. And I understand that those are different things. To date, I've thought of most of our conversation being about hitting the GWSA targets. Is this a proposal to do something different or additional, the term carbon budget as used here?
I don't feel like I can answer that. My understanding is the way you described it in the former, which is around hitting the target for 2025 as in the Global Warming Solutions Act. But perhaps
Yeah,
Julie, you might. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I think, Jared, the distinction here, or what this is driving at, is looking at not just sources but also sinks. There's also a requirement, as you know, in the act to look at getting to net zero carbon, but we don't necessarily have a consistent way for being able to account the benefits of all of our natural and working lands and wetlands, et cetera. And so this is driving at that. I think there will be a few discrete points in time where this analysis will be done, but it's trying to make sure we have essentially we reflect both sides of the ledger, not just the emissions, but understand where the sequestration opportunities are and the magnitude of them as well.
Thank you.
That's great. Yeah. Okay, so just moving through this quickly.
Jane, if I may, I think Lou also had his hand up.
Oh, thanks.
Thank you, Leslie. Yeah, on number 3, I just wanted to touch on the cost effectiveness piece. Obviously, that's going to be, a huge part of what the contractor will do and what we will do. I would just point out that the issue of grid resources and infrastructure need to support these scenarios. Assigning or determining what those resources would be and what infrastructure, if needed, what it would be and what it would cost is a very fraught issue and very involved. So I think that there's maybe a first step to determine what the potential energy and power impacts are of these scenarios, and that there are multiple ways to solve an electricity problem, and that there are, it may not be possible to come up with a single answer that is satisfactory from an efficiency standpoint or from a public interest standpoint, such that it's the analysis required maybe too expansive to cover so many scenarios or so many potential solutions. So I would say that while that's a good goal, I think that determining what the impacts to the power system would be is the first goal there, and then determining how to rectify any such problems found would be the secondary goal.
Yeah, that's really interesting and well said. Thank you for that comment. Any other comments, Leslie Ann or TJ, that I can't see?
No, it looks like you're good. And Lou, would you mind sort of summarizing that and popping it into the chat so that we make sure we don't lose the exact specifics that you were driving at?
Sure.
Thank you.
Okay, so just running through the rest, and then obviously I'll pause and you guys can have some discussion or have me go back to any of the points here. But so number 4, identifying gaps in technology needs, obviously research and development around what's needed to meet Vermont's greenhouse gas reductions. Number 5, which is obviously a key piece for the Global Warming Solutions Act, which is around the finance revenue options. As you all know, in the Global Warming Solutions Act, and as we talked about in the meeting earlier today, one of the things that makes it such a particularly heavy lift in the timeline that we have, it's not just the what do we want to do, but it's the how, and identifying the rules needed, the policy measures, the laws, and that's a lot to get on paper between now and December. Number 6, develop a policy model which identifies obviously the short-term, interim, and long-term policies that we need to meet all of the 2025, 2030, and ultimately the 2050 emissions requirements in the Global Warming Solutions Act. The social cost of carbon associated with number 7 in the value of carbon. And then finally, and probably most important to set us on a path long-term, is thinking about how we're going to monitor and track the work put forward in the first climate action plan to ensure that it's having the benefits that we want to see with respect to emissions controls. for the law. And then obviously being able to monitor and implement as we revise the climate action plan on an every 4-year basis. So I can leave this up for a minute if there are any questions that you all want me to go back to before I stop and sort of just speak to what the ask is of the Science and Data Committee around this work.
Jared, it looks like you have your hand up again.
Yeah, sorry, just one clarifying question, probably, I don't know if this is for Jane or for Secretary Moore, but I'm interested in the connection between point 2 and point 6. It looks like 6 is asking for recommended policies in the short term, the interim, and the long term, whereas in number 2, I see it mainly requesting recommendations around rules, regulations, programs, but it doesn't explicitly talk about policies or legislation. Is that intended, or is that just a language issue that 2 intends policies and potential legislative changes to be included? It's just not explicitly written as such.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the thought is 2 is really trying to cast as wide a net as possible and thinking about what different policy or strategies, initiatives, policies, programs could be used. And then 6 is attempting to sort of organize and put some priority to them, informed by sort of the additional analysis about cost effectiveness and financing and revenue options, and then just timing in terms of implementability. So number 2 is intended to be really big and broad, and then 6 is actually starting to knit the best of those ideas into a cohesive plan or group of plans.
Thank you. And just to wrap that up, so 2 would include policy, even though it's not explicitly stated as such.
Yes.
Thank you.
Stop sharing. Great. So I finally have been struggling with some structural aspects of the ask to the subcommittees in review and how to do that well and efficiently. But I think at this point, we have our head around that some of you, and hopefully more than just some, many of you are interested in reviewing closely and really see the role of this group as informing how we take this RFI from an RFI to an RFP. And the idea being that at the March 22nd Climate Council meeting, there'll be discussion and consideration from not only this committee, but the Cross-Sector Mitigation Committee, as well as the other technical that would likely draw on the technical services, that being rural resilience and adaptation, as well as ag and ecosystems, to inform the RFP that will hopefully be ready to go within a couple days after that March 22nd meeting. And so at this point, I'd like to share the RFI as it was drafted with you all in detail and the 15 proposals. In doing that, though, I will try recognizing that not all of you have the extensive time to read all 15. I will call your attention to probably 3 or 4 in particular to highlight sort of the diversity of answers that we got from the consultants who responded with proposals, as well as to highlight also perhaps within them some consistent themes that came out of the proposals around the timeline, as well as perhaps additional questions or thoughts that we should be putting forward. I also think that as we further explore advancing an RFP, it would be really great at perhaps the next meeting of this subcommittee to dive a little deeper into the work that's already being advanced for the CEP, and really think about what we have there in that body of work and what we're missing based on the proposals that we got, recognizing that the timelines are a little different, and what we may choose to ask for the same thing again in our RFP, or we may choose to build off the work that's already happening between the Public Service Department and DEC. So it sounds crazy, but just functionally, I was struggling with how to share that information with you all because they're not small files. But I found out today that we have a SharePoint site that goes between the AOA, the Agency of Administration, and myself for some things. And what I am going to do this afternoon is post all the RFI, all 15 proposals, create a folder for the RFI, and be able to give you all permission to view all of those. So you won't have editing permission but you'll have the capacity to open them all and review them. And within that, I'll put a short memo that draws your attention to the way I reviewed them, which includes an Excel spreadsheet that I developed that just sort of hits on which proposals were able to touch on all 8 questions, what consultants highlighted their expertise with answering 1 or 2 of the questions. And I try to draw your attention to some themes that I picked up when I read them all, and point you in the direction, fully appreciating whatever attention and review you can give to any and all of them. And then hope that at our next meeting, if that's enough time, that we'll be able to come back and actually have a substantive conversation that will inform how we present the work to the full Climate Council on the 22nd. So hopefully that's enough synopsis. Any guidance or questions from all of you in helping inform how I share that information is much appreciated.
So Jane, just to go to the SharePoint site, if it's sort of read only, is there a way of making the Excel spreadsheet or some other feedback more write permissions so that you can keep track of all of these in one place as a.
Well, when I direct you all to the SharePoint site via email to the subcommittee, I can attach the spreadsheet, the Excel spreadsheet to the email. And that perhaps can be a place where you provide any comments or feedback of your own, and recognizing that you cannot share that amongst the group back and forth. You can make any comments and just share it back to me, and I can use that to compile some feedback to this group for next week to share in a public meeting. Does that sound appropriate?
Yeah. Yeah, I was just trying to make sure that there was some way of collecting the feedback that was streamlined and didn't give you extra work for another 10 hours or something.
Appreciate that, Leslie.
I guess my other question is, how does this sort of fit in with the other pieces that we're also working towards, like the scope and talking through some of those?
Yeah, that's it. So many moving pieces. So
I know.
Yeah, I think because it was all moving right before you guys got together on this meeting, but I have shared with all the subcommittees and the Climate Council just before you guys got together some tools for helping with work planning. In the body of that email, I suggested that the Gantt chart that we have now provided to subcommittees is most applicable at this point for the technical subcommittees. So as I said, ag and ecosystems, cross-sector, and rural resilience. And at this point, it seems best for the Science and Data and Just Transitions Committee to sort of pause, work on the RFI, the subcommittee description charter, and wait to then be informed by the timelines and work of the other technical subcommittees in which you are in service to. So I don't see the Gantt chart as being as useful to this group, although it does highlight the milestones that we're all obligated to meet along the way, and some of the dates that are sort of unmovable, with being the December 1st deadline and some of the public engagement key points along the way. So to me, the best use of this committee, and others should speak up, but is informing and helping develop the technical services component at this point. And I think for me, it's a process of how we go back and forth with cross-sector, who's obviously also going to be guiding the use of those technical services contract, as well as, and then how we work those technical services RFPs off of the work that's already moving forward with the comprehensive energy plan. Just a lot of moving pieces fast right now.
I was just curious if that would set us back in terms of the council meeting, the full council meeting on the 22nd, when the scopes were being presented from all of the subcommittees, if we hadn't had a chance to sort of go through and work through that. So.
Sure.
Julie.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be a little bit, there's a little bit of a chicken and egg problem in that we need the other subcommittees to think about what services they believe they're going to need and to have laid out their major milestones. And then there's the overlay of sort of what we're seeing bigger picture and trying to pull in sort of the really valuable input that I think is contained in those RFIs. And it's just as Jane said, it's a lot. Like there's an inordinate amount of information available to us. And I think trying to chart a path that allows us to bring all of those disparate pieces together, I'm not sure we'll be done on the 22nd, maybe is the long story short of that. I think but what we need is enough of a perspective on the recommendations from those RFIs and our own thinking in that space, I guess from my perspective, that it allows us to use that as the lens we apply in hearing about the proposed scope of work for each of the other subcommittees, right? Like we have to have both of these disparate things need to inform each other and then ultimately get mushed together in crafting the RFP. And it is a chicken and egg. I don't know which one comes first, and maybe we have to do both and then come back together and see if we can't integrate them into the next technical RFP. That may have made no sense to anyone because I'm really struggling with.
Well, in terms of timing, it seems to me that we could, leave our subcommittee scope broad enough to capture the work that we need to do and get that done. I feel a need to move on and get into the work plan, but the work plan I don't think we could have ready for all the reasons that have been stated. And by March 22nd, we need to hear from the other subcommittees. And if we can nail down our scope, then I think we can start working on the work plan. Things that we need definitions of and things that we know we need to do, and start stacking the timing of those. But we won't be able to complete it until after we get the breadth of the other subcommittees' plans. Does that resonate with anybody? Just for the record, I see some nodding and some thumbs, but no voices. But Secretary Moore, you're showing off your team's skills there with the live action.
I spent a long time
emojis.
yesterday. They changed up all the icons, so I had to figure out what my new tools are. But I can throw up emojis with the best of them now.
Yeah.
Y'all watch out.
So not to get too far down our agenda, but I think we have, from these discussions, we have a couple of action items for our next agenda anyway, and action items that we're going to need to do over the next week, right? It's Jane, it looked like you were going to say something. So.
No, well, I got distracted by the new tools too, and we can. Sorry, you can have everybody on the screen at once now. I didn't realize that. I was just going to suggest that I appreciate all the feedback on the RFIs, and I'll look forward to sharing those tonight with you all, just to wrap up that conversation.
Right, great, thank you. So it sounds like we have a task to review the RFIs and talk about them, in our next meeting next week, in terms of how we can I guess when you send those out, Jane, if you could, frame up the question that,
Yes.
or questions that you want us to answer. But, broadly speaking, it's how do we best turn those in from RFI to RFP?
Right.
Yeah, although, yeah, it gets back to the chicken or the egg that we may not know exactly that full answer until after we hear from all the other subcommittees. So
Right.
just have a
Oh,
discussion.
it might occur to me that this is a question for you, Jane. If the RFIs are a mixed bag between the types of things that were submitted, would it be helpful for if folks had specific expertise? And I'm thinking some of the folks on the subcommittee who have strong expertise in utilities, let's say, to make sure that they look at those pieces closer because they're able to speak to those closer. And then others who have expertise in, I don't know, transportation, let's say, to make sure that they take a deeper dive into that. And then fuel operations, to make sure that we're not missing anything there. Would it make sense to parse it out like that, or to just?
They're not broken up by sector or work. They're broken up by the 8 questions. And actually, surprisingly, as I started, the first few I reviewed, people had only answered 1 or 2 or 3 points of the 8 questions, but the majority of them speak to all 8 questions. And so I think it's hard. It'll be hard to parse them out, but you'll see in my spreadsheet that I have the 8 components of the RFI and then the vendors who responded, the consultants who responded, and what they spoke to in the proposal. So, I mean, perhaps if there are specific of those 8 questions, if people want to be looking through them with a specific lens on of one of those 8 questions, that might be helpful. But otherwise, I think it's just reviewing for the full gamut.
And just to close the loop on one thing, I think as part of, the timing might not be exactly right, but as part of the discussion next week, I think it would be appropriate for me to present for 20 minutes or so. I think it'll take at least on the comprehensive energy plan, and Jane and I will hopefully work together in the coming week to really create and get down on that Venn diagram we just talked about. Because I think in reviewing the RFIs, you won't have it for while you're reviewing them initially, at least for the discussion, but I think it could help the context of the discussion if we have that next meeting. It's a suggestion, and if you folks say no, I don't need to prepare a presentation on it, so I'll be okay with that, but I do think it would be helpful. Except one caveat, if you think it's better to tee that up for the full Climate Council, that type of presentation, I'm happy to do it there also.
I was wondering that, and I'd love to hear comment on that. Like, I think it could actually even be necessary to do it twice. Like, I kind of feel like there's this conversation with respect to technical services that is best guided through this subcommittee, right? And the movement and development of the RFP. And in order to do that, I think everybody needs to have an understanding of the work that's already been done or is being done as part of the comprehensive energy plan and elsewhere. And then from that, like in seeing TJ's question, like presentation, I was able to ask questions. Well, how does this align with what you've done, Jared, at EAN? And like what is the difference in these models, and what are we trying to get at? And I think it would be good for this committee to bounce that around and have a more detailed conversation, perhaps, than what is needed at the council, where it's like presented as a recommendation informed by perhaps some ground setting of knowledge about the comprehensive energy plan and the overlap and all of that. I'm not sure if does that make sense, or it seems like at the very least, we should have it at this subcommittee, and then we can decide how best to present it to the full council.
Yeah, I would just throw out there that I think it's a really important piece that the whole council has vision to. It's really going to set the tone for our work plans, all of our work plans, right? So we don't want to duplicate efforts, and we want to make sure that the plans are in sync.
Right. So, well, I will plan on it for the next meeting of this subcommittee, and then we'll. It sounds like there may be some desire to have it at the full council. Also, happy to do that if that's what's decided. So, Secretary Moore.
Yeah, I was just going to build on what Brian was saying. I think it is important for the full council to have eyes on it, but the challenge is one that we're sort of one of the two committees that's looking across the entire scope of work, and that's why I think having us draft an RFP, let folks sort of respond to their component of what that likely scope of services is going to be, but I think the obligation sits with us to both knit all the work of the three technical subcommittees together into a coherent request, and also be mindful, frankly, TJ, of the work the department's doing around the comprehensive energy plan and sort of the expertise you bring in helping make sure that we work entirely internally consistent with how we're approaching these two efforts.
Okay. So I think that, oh, I'm sorry, Jared, looked like your hand was up.
Yeah, thanks. Just quickly, I want to clarify one thing and make sure that we've got common agreement on it. And that is totally agreed on the value of the kind of outline of this comprehensive energy plan and process. And the value of being aware of that and aligning with that to the extent that that's possible. I want to make sure, though, that doesn't necessarily assume that we wouldn't move forward with key pieces that the council needs for the climate action plan and timeline that aren't going to be met with. I mean, so I think that there's an element of that where we wouldn't necessarily want to duplicate something that we know is going to happen through the CEP process. But if there's something we need sooner or in a different way, I think we want to retain the ability. And I think that that's probably obvious to everybody. I just want to state it, that there may be things that are additional to, supplemental to, different from the CEP consulting and pathways modeling that we'll need, that will be in this separate RFP.
I totally agree.
I do as well.
Jay had his hand up.
Hey, Leslie Ann, can you hear me okay?
Yep, go ahead.
Yeah, would it be to safely say at a very high level the comprehensive energy plan is more the roadmap and what we'd like to do, and the work of this group is really where the rubber hits the road and how we could execute in some of the things that are in the comprehensive energy plan? Because reading through that plan to me seems like it's all great ideas, but we may not be hitting all those targets. Is that like kind of a safe read on how I'm interpreting that?
Well, I'll speak to the energy plan first, I guess, is that I think there's still discussion in exactly the format of this plan as we go forward, and we want to get stakeholder input on that. That plan was it had the 90% renewable by 2050 vision, and then it had hundreds of recommendations kind of scattered throughout. Our initial thought, or thinking, that is we will want to get feedback on is, should it be more of a strategic plan and a path to kind of get from A to B. So I don't want to I think your characterization of the last plan isn't far off, but I don't necessarily want to say that's exactly how the next plan is going to look. And I'll let maybe Jane or Secretary Moore speak to the climate action plan side of it.
Well, I mean, yes, certainly. I think that we have to identify how we're going to implement and actually move and advance what was goals and is now statutory requirements of greenhouse gas reduction. So we certainly, and we don't have, you know, by the time the plan is adopted, if we stay on this timeline, which is aggressive, we'll still only have like 3 years to actually hit the 2025 targets. So yeah, certainly will be where the rubber hits the road will need to happen in the plan.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so thank you. That was a good discussion on kind of our path forward in that area, and thank you, Jane, and all members who participated. I do want to move on to subcommittee scope. I foreshadowed my desire to kind of get this done, but I don't want to force it either if there's more discussion to be had here. And so this morning, Melissa sent around to subcommittee members a revised version that had some further comments on it. I'm going to try and pull that up right now. So can everybody see that? I can't see anybody, so I need some affirmative.
Yes, we can see it.
Thank you, Jane. You're the one person I can see right now.
Okay, good.
So.
Lucky you.
Yeah. So I guess the way I want to go through this is I'm going to highlight the 2 small changes I made, and then I'll ask Secretary Moore, you made some other changes and comments, and I wanted to throw those out there. I think otherwise the language is the same that it's been, except for our R2 revisions. And so, and I'm going to assume that folks have looked through it. So my 2 changes here were just on the highlights, the yellow highlighted areas, and they're really small. I'm going to start with the second one first. That's on 3B here. And this was originally a change that I put in it was really to make the sentence grammatically correct, but in doing so, I had written description of the relative contribution, etc. And that really wasn't consistent with the statutory language of the DWSA. So I replaced that, put the word reflection back in. Hopefully that's not controversial. And the other change is to add climate here to, this was a section that I and Claire put in here into the subcommittee scope on just reflecting some of the conversation we had previously on identifying critical gaps in data. And the language we didn't put in before didn't talk about climate at all. And so I just wanted to add that it's representative of a broader scope of the committee. And so
TJ, when you have climate just before baselines, what does it mean in terms of an actual physics thing?
Good question. I think of that as, if we're talking about, if the Climate Council needs to have climate adaptation strategies, and we need to have some sort of understanding of where we are, both in kind of what the current state of climate science is and how we expect it to change going forward, and then how we can affect that change, I guess. So that's how I'm thinking about that. That may not be accurate, so open to feedback.
Yeah, I might move baselines to be after where you say emissions, so energy use and emissions baselines. But if it's climate change and climate change science, then that it baselines are kind of interesting word to put there, because it almost sounds as if you have a starting point and then you have climate or climate change from a starting point, and it's more of a fluid process in terms of the whole Earth atmosphere system. So putting it next to baseline, and it doesn't quite get at what it is I think you're trying to get at.
Just for my own understanding, when we talk about baselines for climate, would you think of something like degree days or something like that?
Not necessarily. So we Jay can probably jump in here. If you use the word baseline, it usually means that there's some sort of reference point that's stable and stationary, and then you make your adjustments or your measurements from there. And the notion of weather and climate is that it fluctuates, and you can look at it from an average perspective, you can look at it from a departure from that or an extremes, but there isn't this sort of one flat monotonic or whatever that you then look at differently.
This is Richard. I might, a different way to put that is that we don't expect our efforts, effective as they might be, to actually change climate in a measurable way. That is, what Vermont does by itself is not going to change climate. And so we would not expect whatever parameters you use to budge off of the baseline because of our efforts in themselves. So that's actually what came into my mind when I looked at this, because we are hoping to change energy use and emissions against some baseline, but we're not really, we would love it if our efforts would in fact change the whole planet's climate, but it seems unlikely.
What if, you know, at the risk of wordsmithing here, and again, somebody just stop me if this isn't, if you don't think it's a good use of time. Again, I want to work through this scope. You know, taking energy use, emissions, and climate and putting it before the word data, and then deleting the whole reference to baselines. And I think the real focus of this edition was to have the committee identify the critical gaps. And from the discussion before, we didn't want to leave out gaps in climate-related data. And I think that is really the intent of what we're trying to put here. Does that work?
Yeah.
I can move it in real time and you can see how it looks if you.
And I would just make the friendly amendment that if it is climate change, then we probably should put climate change or climate science or something like that.
My computer doing this real time is very slow. So I am climate is not my expertise. So should it be climate change or climate science?
I would be happy with either climate change or climate science, because when you say climate and you're really talking about it from a climatological perspective, it's looking at all of the processes that make up the climate of a region or the world, whereas climate change is looking at, you know, changes over time, changes in characteristics, either from a mathematical perspective or the impacts and so on. So I think we're trying to get more of the climate change or the climate science piece, and not climate, which is larger than climate change.
Okay. Should it be climate change science? I just being a little flip there. I apologize. So, Richard, your hand. I see your hand. Perhaps
It was an old hand, yeah.
hand.
Yeah.
Okay, so now it reads, identify critical gaps in availability of and/or access to energy use, emissions, and climate science data that would be ideally used to provide recommendations on how to develop the data sets to support future modeling, monitoring, and/or evaluation work. Okay, I see a lot of thumbs up and I hear no objections. So thank you. Secretary Moore, do you want to raise your questions or describe changes?
Well, the first one really is a question, which is just, I guess I wasn't clear as I read back through it what the clause that was added there was intended to get at. That I guess I couldn't determine if it was, yeah, I was I was really struggling. Thank you for bringing up my question. Is this the emissions inventory or perspectives in terms of individual and community level concerns, from when we're talking about key sectors and populations, and then just also not entirely clear on how where this question stops or statement stops in the work of the Just Transition Committee would pick up.
And I think I was the one who had tweaked this language a little bit, and it was designed to be that crossover or the handshaking, and not to sort of take away from the work that the Just Transitions Committee was doing, but to work alongside them, so that in looking at some of the policies and the data and the science, that we're not only focusing on either certain geographic regions or certain population density types or that sort of thing, but making sure that all of the populations across the entire state were sort of factored in. So it's not to replace their work, it's to work alongside.
Maybe it's that it would do better then as a standalone item. I guess it's just, you know, to my mind, the best available science is sort of one piece of this, and then, you know, thinking about is I'm worried that I understand what I think it is you're trying to do. I'm worried it creates an overlap with the Just Transitions Committee, and that's what I see as part of their role, is ensuring that the work of the other three subcommittees does take into account sort of a diversity of perspectives and make sure we're accounting for all sectors and populations. And maybe I just need to think more about it with that sort of context, Leslie Ann.
Mm-hmm.
Brian, I can see your hand. I don't know if anyone else can. Why don't you go ahead while I
While you think?
Yes.
You're on mute, Brian. Still on mute, Brian.
Sorry about that. So my thought on the conversation we had last week was to ensure that the data that was utilized was representative of no particular subset of whether it be geography or people. It doesn't necessarily have to overlap. It's more of a check to make sure that whatever data is being used, that it is more of a global representation.
I think that if that's the intent, I think that makes clear the difference. I guess my concern is we're learning from the analyses of the other subcommittees, right? Like it's no longer a data focus, I guess, or it's not explicitly a data focus the way it's drafted. We're going to interpret their analyses to determine if the perspectives are there, right? Like that to me isn't a data piece.
Yeah, I mean, to me, I think it is the data piece, and we wouldn't be necessarily checking their conclusions. We just want to make sure the data is appropriate for that conclusion. I may be wrong, but that's what I thought the conversation was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And as you were talking there, Brian, one of the things that popped back to me when I was thinking about our work sort of meshing with all of the other subcommittees was also to think about the rural resilience, which does a lot of the hazards piece.
Mhm.
And when you think about hazards and extreme events and how those kind of play together, it's one of those pieces that as they do their particular sets of analyses and thought processes and coming up with various streams and recommendations, that if there's anything that we could do to assist that from a data or science perspective, and when I think about hazards, that is very, very much science and data driven, that there's some of that crosswalk and crosstalk also taking place.
What if taking what's been said here, if we added the words "have been omitted from data and or modeling," and then kind of after the word "omitted," does that give the specificity and tie it back to this committee sufficiently, while also kind of keeping the iterative the goal of the kind of that iterative nature of this provision?
But I think that gets at what I was struggling with. Yes.
Does that clarify?
Yeah.
Yep. I like that. Thank you. Thank you for helping make sense of my muddled mind.
And I guess one of the other things that might help with clarity here, so here's just one suggestion, would be to take out the word perspectives, because that almost makes it seem like it's kind of public opinion polling or focus groups, whereas what we're trying to make sure is represented is the data that reflects key sectors and populations, and is inclusive demographically, by geography, by race and income, all of those different factors. Whereas perspectives, to me, it feels like that is more of like the public engagement strategy, some of the work of the Just Transitions Committee, because I don't think we're talking about opinion polling or data here to capture opinion. It's more the data, the demographic, physical, economic data that we're focused on, is my understanding.
That makes sense to me. Any objections to removing the highlighted language?
So say that again, Jared. That what your perception of perspectives comes up as?
Is kind of like, it makes me think of opinion polls or focus groups. And so my suggestion was just to say, learn from their analyses whether key sectors and populations have been omitted. But I may be missing something or misunderstanding the definition of it.
Right.
I just want to make sure we're not signing the Science and Data Committee up to do kind of focus groups and public opinion polling.
Right. The determining the perspective seems like the Just Transitions Committee, and then whether those have been omitted from the data or modeling is what we need to do. Is that?
Yeah, that captures it, TJ.
So if we delete the highlighted section here, I think that gets to the root of it.
Brian, is yours a new hand or an old hand?
Okay, I'm gonna delete it. Right.
If it's
Yeah.
okay, as you do so, TJ, I just want to clarify. I think that type of work is incredibly important. I just want to make sure we're clear about roles and responsibilities of who's doing that work. And that feels more in the kind of area of responsibility of the full council and the Dress Transitions Committee.
Okay. Before we go on, well, I want to do a quick time check because it's 2:23. I would love to get through this, but I don't know if folks can stay on a little bit longer. And I want to leave time for public comment and have one more thing to share on the training for subcommittee members. So, does anybody have to leave in the next, by right at 2:30? So I heard.
Did you raise your hand, Jared?
Yeah.
Yeah, I might need to pop off at 2:31 and a half.
Okay. All right. I think we should. We're going to have to do this section at the next meeting. Then, unfortunately. Although I actually don't know that major milestones for subcommittees is part of our scope of work. And so maybe we don't need to do that.
Can I just share what I was thinking, which is ultimately I part of the challenge and in thinking about the bigger schedule sort of questions that you had highlighted at the beginning of the meeting, that was the topic of conversation between science and data and cross-sector mitigation, is just we've got sort of some early work and then some other work that maybe is a little bit less time sensitive, but understanding the timelines being laid out by I think probably realistically all three technical subcommittees, and what that means in terms of what we have to undertake by when is going to be really important and something we need to get to as soon as possible. And so I was trying to at least identify what I saw as the major work products coming out of this committee, and then trying to think about what's reasonable in terms of timing, so that can be that can help inform the timelines that'll ultimately be established by the other technical subcommittees.
Right. Thank you, Secretary Moore. That's really helpful. So in my mind, that seems to be our work plan. Like everything in this list is pursuant to the scope above. So what I would like to propose to do is take this section up as part of the work plan discussion for the next time, to the extent we have time with the other stuff on the agenda. I will accept all. Oh, my intern is participating. She's very protective when somebody walks by. Accept all the changes to the scope of work.
The joys of Teams in live time.
So I'm gonna
We've
struggle
all
with
had this.
holding her while I finish this. I'm going to accept all the changes to the scope of work here, and we'll send that back around. Sorry, send that back around, and we can finalize that hopefully with a quick stroke of the pen at the next meeting, and then talk about this as part of the work plan. Jane, could you say something briefly, very quickly, about the training that you sent around?
Yeah, thank you for that, TJ. So in the email, there was a memo attached about open governance training. in that we request that all new members and or folks participating on the subcommittee, be it state staff who did not sit through the training that occurred at the Climate Council meeting back in November, should all watch the videos as linked in the memo, as well as review the supporting PowerPoints. And then also encourage, if folks have the time who have already sat through the training, it wouldn't hurt to sit through it again as you're diving into the meat of your work. And then I'll work to schedule Matt Chapman, the General Counsel for the Agency of Natural Resources, to join this meeting next week for a few minutes within your agenda to be able to answer any questions or that come up after having reviewed those PowerPoints as well as the video.
Thank you,
I can
Jared.
ask,
Oh, go ahead, Jared.
I just have a clarifying question, just to go back a second and make sure that we're on the same page. So are we adopting by consensus the scope minus the milestones, which we'll address in the work plan, but basically we're saying as a subcommittee, the scope above those major milestones with the changes reflected on the screen that we've made today is our consensus-based scope for now.
So I didn't call that question. I think we could, but what I proposed doing was just accepting all the changes and removing the comments and sending it out to do that perhaps quickly at the next meeting.
Okay.
Just to make sure that everybody can read a clean copy of it.
Got it. Thanks. Sorry, I missed that.
That's all right.
That's a good question, Jared, because it would be nice to have one last, set of input before we kind of check it off and say all done.
But we do need to finish it. I would like to finish it, and hopefully everybody would before the full Climate Council meeting. So with that, next agenda was on our agenda, but I think we've covered that with several items that will fill 90 minutes next week. And so I think we can move on to public comment today.
TJ, just one thing is if you would like to address perhaps a shift in the meeting schedule.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. Leslie Ann had mentioned that at least one person has back-to-back meetings, and there was a suggestion that maybe we start at 1:30 and go until 3. Does that work better for folks? Does that work worse for folks? Any comment on that proposal?
Maybe if you stop sharing your screen, TJ, folks can just sort of like do like this or like this.
I'm sorry. I forget that it's being shared. So.
Yeah, and then that way we could see everybody, and then folks can either do their thumbs up, show off their brand new skills. So does that work?
It works. It creates a bit of a conflict for me next week, but I think I can move it. Standing, it's fine. So.
That's okay by me.
Okay, Brian, does that work? Okay, thank you. Lou? All right, and thanks, Jay. Secretary Moore? Oh. That's the point of having these things. So your camera's off and you can just do like that. Okay. All right.
So thank you for reminding me of that, and thank you for raising it in the first place, Leslie Ann. So I think we will move the standing time to 1:30 to 3 o'clock.
Okay.
Okay. So now I believe we're to the point of the agenda where we can open the floor for public comment. George.
afternoon. Want to take this opportunity to thank the Science Data Committee for their work on this. It's obviously a complicated beast you're tackling, and wanted to speak to the contribution that I published yesterday along with my co-author, Jim DeMont. Jim DeMont could not be here today. He's at a trial. So I'd like to just spend a moment, if I can, introducing and overviewing the contribution that we submitted yesterday. It speaks to life cycle accounting methodology for greenhouse gas emissions in Vermont and those emissions that are upstream from the various sources of energy in Vermont. The submission yesterday had actually two components. The cover letter speaks to the data sources that were used in this document. And in particular, the cover letter speaks to how you could develop a provisional life cycle greenhouse gas methodology that is able to make your deadlines for this year, which are obviously considerable. The main document has several sections in it, 7 of them, and then a bunch of appendices that elaborate on various technical topics. Section 1 is germane in the sense that it talks to the legal statutes that are relevant to your life cycle greenhouse gas emissions methodology. That was part that was written with help from Jim. And it also looks at what is known as the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which is an international organization standard that was developed originally for tracking emissions in corporations, and since then has evolved to include other types of entities such as cities and nonprofit organizations and governments. So that's new to you, I think is well worth delving into to get the background, because it speaks to the different scopes of greenhouse gas emissions, and what a life cycle emissions assessment has to do is consider all 3 scopes that are involved and which ones are relevant. Other sections deal with the specific upstream emissions that are dealt with in fossil fuels or hydroelectric or biofuels. And certainly they're fairly complicated issues, but nonetheless, there's already been a significant body of work by research in academia and by our national laboratories. One in particular I want to bring up is the GREET model that is out of Oregon National Laboratory. This was originally developed to evaluate greenhouse gas emissions out of the transportation sector. It is actually a very valuable resource to quantify emissions of all types, those that are not necessarily in the transportation sector, but in other sectors as well. And it's a fairly mature tool at this juncture. It's been in publication, I think, for most of a decade. And it was actually one of the foundational pieces in this work. So I recommend it highly. Certainly, if you have questions along the way, you're welcome to address them to either Jim or I. I can carry the technical side of these, and Jim can certainly speak to the legal side of these. And with that, I'll let go of the mic. And then if you have questions, I'd be willing to entertain them now. Thank you.
So how would members of the committee get access to the document that Mr. Gross is talking about?
It was emailed to your chairs yesterday. I don't know if it's been distributed to the membership, though.
I'm not advocating one way or the other. I would just be interested in seeing it. So.
Okay. Also, I had sent a copy late last night to the co-chair at the cross-sector mitigation committee, Mr. Covart, and requested he distribute it at that membership as well, since I have an inkling that your work and their work are very much involved in this issue, and it's likely you'll have to coordinate whatever you do.
Great. Thank you, George. I appreciate you providing that the input and the papers, Section 2A of the scope we just went through talks about reviewing our approach to emissions inventories and accounting, and I think we can figure out the best way to include review of these types of documents in the work plan coming up. So I'm not sure if it's been distributed to the subcommittee yet. I thought I saw something come through, but it may not have been, but we will get it out to everybody.
Excellent. I look forward to working with you on it. Thank you.
Great. And Mark Whitworth.
Yeah, thanks, TJ. I would like to request that documents such as the one that George has described be posted rather than distributed via email, so that the public can see it too.
Yeah. Okay. It is on the AOA website, but I'll draw attention to that too.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you. That's a good point, Mark. And so thanks for pointing that out, Jane, that it is on the website, and we'll make sure it gets distributed specifically to the subcommittee members and the location. Any other public comment? Well, thank you all for sticking around an extra 10 minutes, particularly to members of the public who have sat through the entire meeting. I'll take Leslie Ann's thunder in thanking you. That's normally her role.
Come on. Gotta leave me something here.
Yeah. Well, and just very much appreciate the discussion today, and look forward to continuing. Leslie Ann, any closing thoughts?
No, I think we had a really deep dive today that was very, very productive, and getting towards really starting to flesh out where we want to go. I think we still have some big picture things to iron out, like what the plan is going to look like, but I think we're on our way. So I thank everybody for sticking around, and look forward to chatting with you folks next week.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you all.
Take care.
Bye.